Hello, very beautiful community. What we can learn about the moral psychology of the Charlie Kirk shooter or the suspect can also tell us a lot about the malaise and nihilism out there in American society or in the West or in the modern world, in a way that tells us quite a bit about what the prospects are of us keeping our democracies. So let's dive a little bit deeper and upturn a few stones that we normally don't readily approach. Here's an example of the sort of thing that's out there on the internet. This tweet before us says the problem isn't college, it's not Discord, it's not Helldivers 2, which is presumably a video game or whatever. The problem is that the US is a nihilistic, dying society that offers no hope. Now, that tweet is ambiguous for me because it's not clear whether the point is that this is an American problem, whether America is just an example of a global problem, some kind of Western-centered or modernity-centered nihilistic decay. Here is a response from Jeremy Morris, who's a wonderful Russia expert doing wonderful ethnographic and sociological work. I recommend. Is this phenomenon characteristic of US white youth socialization more than elsewhere? If we had guns in the UK or in Germany, would we see things like this happen more? Let's just schematically say a few things about the suspect, things that you all almost certainly know. Talking about a 22-year-old from Utah who was briefly attended Utah State University for a semester. Came from a Republican family. Parents seem to be registered Republicans. He is apparently registered to vote, but has not been voting. He is reported to have played a lot of video games. At the time of the crime, it looks like he was a third-year student in the electrical apprenticeship program at Dixie Technical College. Parents are active in the community. Mom is a social worker, Mormon family background, it seems, and authorities found unfired bullet casings near his rifle engraved with various phrases and memes that are open to interpretation, on which I won't legislate on this occasion. So, where are we with this? Well, the first thing to say before we do any kind of deep dive is how disgraceful is the President of the United States' response to this? Without evidence, blaming a sort of semi-real, semi-fictional demographic on this crime and stoking division and increasing the risk of violence in the future. I mean, as I said on the live yesterday, that act alone in a well-ordered, idealized society that doesn't exist anywhere in the real world would be enough to get a permanent lifelong ban from public life. But we're not going to talk about Trump's irresponsibility and erratic speech, but look together at what lies more deeply in the moral psychology of the kind of crime we witnessed and what it says more generally about our society and the United States in particular. So, the first thing to understand, I think, is that unfortunately for us, violence is among the transcendent experiences humans have. Many, many years ago, Chris Hedges wrote a book in which he talked about war and the experience, direct experience of war, being a matter of sort of lifting the carpet and looking beneath at the substance of existence. So, like childbirth, like certain spiritual and religious experiences, like certain experiences of art, like perhaps an experience of the dying process, engagement with violence has a kind of surreality to it. And I don't mean surrealism in the sense that we're all familiar with, the sense of the absurd, but in the sense that preceded surrealism as a movement, which is just the sense of something surreal as something realer than the real, something hyper-real. Unfortunately, violence has this very, very dangerous, transcendent capacity. Next thing we might mention is the crisis of men in our culture. The alt-right will have you believe that it has a particular shape, that they have the solution. They don't, and it doesn't have the shape they say it does. But contrary to, if you like, the woke resistance liberals, the crisis is real. What's it about? It's about economic exclusion. There's a class component there. And cultural inarticulacy. Heterosexual men, do not recognize the roles offered to them in society, the descriptions these roles come with, and the rebellious instincts they have against these roles are themselves scary and confusing to them, and they don't know what to do. This doesn't affect 70-year-olds. It affects 30 and 40-year-olds. Does it still affect 19 and 20-year-olds, or are we getting a new generation? Is an interesting question, and there is more nuance. So the problem is that the solution to this, for a lot of men, is a kind of attempt at domination out of weakness. And much of what the, if you like, the self-help, the alt-right oriented self-help industry does is encourage men fundamentally to not solve this, but just to kind of put on a wolf's suit while remaining a sheep. Notice that a lot of the thought leaders in the, if you like, Joe Rogan podcast affiliated self-help industry are very strong on getting wealthy, very strong on muscles, going to the gym, very strong on being very proactive in your job. Okay, this is good. But it's no good if these things are offered in terms of a kind of spiritual salvation, but in the end fail to act as one, because the boys with muscles who these are the thought leaders who are wealthy and who are doing well in their career, are inside scared babies with clattering teeth about the existential predicament of being in the world. And a classic example here is the self-help thought leader Jordan Peterson, who does need to be given enormous credit because he faces biologic mental health challenges that are extreme and deals with them with extraordinary strength and courage. But despite this, Jordan Peterson it's still accurate to say that Jordan Peterson is shitting his pants existentially. So a lot of these boys with muscles who are very proactive are still scared babies, and therefore they are, in their own terms, still beta males. They're not alpha males. We need to talk about this in much greater depth, but there's a sort of clear story here of a potential intersection between the crisis of men and the sort of false salvation type promise violence can give. There are, of course, more broadly the issues of the malaise of modernity, which is not to do with men, not to do with any particular culture, but it's to do with what life is like after the First World War. And it's possible that there is something very exposed about modern life that makes people feel that things that are supposed to be real are no longer quite real versions of themselves. There's a kind of an artifice to our life, which means that a lot of us find it not quite real. I find it ultimately real, but there's a cultural pressure to not find it real that does have something to do with modernity, something to do with the difficulties of any life being entirely satisfactory under the exposed conditions of the modern world. A next distinction worth mentioning is what I might call a distinction between presence and absence. somebody can have very destructive impulses and act on them. That's a presence. So do understand that being bad is not just a failure to be good. It is a positive presence of destructive human capabilities. But at the same time, often being bad is an absence of something good. So one question is, why does a boy like this commit a crime like that? But another question is, why don't other boys in Utah who are angry and confused not resort to violence like this? What has gone right for them that at least they're stopped from doing this? And then I think it's worth mentioning what I might call disinhibiting or escalatory factors. One is obviously accessibility of guns. And here we can put that simply in conjunction with the dumb recklessness of young males, aside from our culture, aside from the crisis of men, aside from anything else. I mean, look at me. I got sick at 22. And now, as a result of my microvascular damage post-COVID, I'm much more sick and I don't go anywhere. But I went around quite a lot before I was sick and a little bit after too. So as a 44-year-old male who has a very healthy relationship with safety, why did I engage in, of course, benign, but still reckless activities when I was young, up until about 24, 25, when I stopped being dumb, right? Why did I, in 2001, get driven around in my underpants on the back of an open cattle truck in northern Cuba with all the locals laughing at me? Why, when I went to visit Nietzsche's archive in Salisbury in Switzerland in the year 2000, did I get stuck a kilometer up a mountain with a dear friend who was also there in Cuba? And we had to inquire about helicopter rescue. Why did I, already after being sick but on a better day, nearly drown people I love by driving them in pretty much a dinghy into open ocean in the South Pacific on a stormy day when the sky was black? Because I just wanted to get to an island no matter what the conditions were. So that kind of dumb behavior I stopped at the age of 24. So even smart males are inconceivably dumb until a certain age. That's a factor. There is something else that we've got to speak about delicately, because one of the features of our channel is we're very much in love with people with ADHD and other forms of neurodiversity. But is there something literally and metaphorically ADHD about US culture that favors very positive but also very negative extreme behavior? Now, I don't think it's in itself a very convincing fact that there's arguably more ADHD diagnoses in America than in many European countries, because there is something bigger out there for which there is no evidence, but which is speculatively very convincing. And that's that to jump on a boat to America or to Australia is something that is much easier to do for a neurodiverse person in the past. So that's why, very speculatively, because there is no evidence for this as far as I can tell, it's reasonable to think in that direction about the extra presence of ADHD in a country like Australia or the United States. Now, then something else happens. If there's a disproportionate number of ADHD folks in a certain culture, the culture itself adjusts to that, and that also has social consequences. These are very benign and very beautiful consequences, but there's also a risk of negatively impulse-based consequences too. Because in the end, of course, neurodiversity sort of tends to exaggerate things, right? If you have ADHD or autism for that matter, your neurodiversity might make you a better musician, but it might also make you better at not having good impulse control and doing things that are destructive. Now, something else that's important, of course, is simply that certain people are born with a degree of psychopathy or other challenges that has nothing to do with the culture. That's a factor too. So everything we've named goes along a certain axis that's worth mentioning. And that might be the distinction with which we nearly started when we cited these tweets, between social explanation and cultural explanation. Cultural explanation might say something is an American problem. Social explanation might say, well, either it isn't, it's a problem everywhere where the same social forces are in play, or it is an American problem, but it's an American problem because there are very special social forces in America that drive this, and this isn't really something we need to explain at the level of culture. And so the first tweet we read about the special nihilism of the US, that did lean more in the idea of saying this is something where we need to lead with a cultural explanation. And then Jeremy Morris's response led with a thought that social explanation might be enough to cover most of this. The distinction between cultural explanation and social explanation is never going to be sharp, but it's important that you understand that it's there and that it's real. You know, an example of it, though I won't comment on that directly in that video, will come out in my next main channel video, where I say that an ideology is doing the rounds across the globe that has elements of monarchism and elements of neoliberalism and fascization too. But then I say that in Russia, there's a special mystical element to that ideology that is not present elsewhere. So here is an example of an ideology that's generated by social forces, but then also deflected, refracted by culture, meaning that it has special manifestations under particular cultural circumstances, like the Russian one, where it takes a more mystical form, as far as the folks in the regime, in the Putin regime, go at least. So we've done more circling around and upturning stones and clarifying ourselves, but in a way, that's enough. Throwing just lumps of paint on the canvas can be illuminating too. We had a go at that. I hope it was a little bit useful. Talk very, very soon. Lots of love.